All right, let's go ahead and build our very first test. Before we do so, when you make your test, your overarching test, before you actually create the questions that will populate it, we want to turn our attention over here to the far right tab for question settings. If we go in here, the first thing I want to point out under all of these options is for scoring. Now, this first option here, the default point value when making a question, the default value is 10. If most of your questions are going to be worth 1 point, then you should probably change that to 1. And then for questions that are different, you can change those after the question has been created. And then what these two options below that mean, the first option for using currently assigned points means that if you were to add this question to a future test, it's going to have the same point value that you give it here. Otherwise, you can give it the default or a different default point value regardless of what the question was worth in a prior test. And then for the feedback, generally for every question you can assign some kind of feedback. It can be a graphic, it can be a little text, feedback, or any mix of the two. But you always have two options. One feedback for if you're correct, and one feedback for if you are wrong. If you want to have individual feedback options for every single possible answer that they can create, because all of the answers and the feedback will be different, then you should probably check this checkbox. And then now, when you make a question, you can determine what you're going to tell them for every single possible answer that you give them. And so it makes for a much more interactive and engaging test because you're able to respond to every single answer they could possibly make. But it's also going to be a lot more work for you, so do keep that in mind. And then if we want to, we have the additional option of including an image, a file, and a web link either to the answer or to individual feedback. So maybe we can have a link that says, all right, since you guessed this answer incorrectly with this response, click this link to learn more about this topic. So you can really make your test very interactive and responsive to your students' answers. And then this guy I pretty much leave as the default. I don't really use categories or levels of difficulty yet, but you do have the option of doing that if you want to. And that's just a way of adding some more information to your questions. So you could make a new test where all of the levels of difficulty are challenging, or all of the topics relate to maybe biology or surgery or a area of the body or a chemistry or whatever you want to do, you can do it, essentially. And then also for scoring, I usually keep these guys at their default as well for displaying the answers randomly, and then you can choose if you want the answers to be vertical or horizontal, and so on and so forth. Partial credit, negative points. You can also provide an option for giving answers extra credit if you want to. So yeah. Once we have all of our question settings for this test in place, we can go ahead and submit. And then we come back to our test where we can now begin to implement various kinds of questions. And then last but not least, to kind of go back a second, back to the individual feedback per individual answers. Here is an example of that with the multiple question type. So you have your question title, you have your question here, you have your question options. Now below that you have your answers, and this is where, if we've enabled individual feedback, we can basically give a response to the user with an optional link and a web link or an image. So you can do a link or an image, either or, and also a file that they will see based off of whatever answer they choose. And you don't have to actually put anything in here. That's fine as well. But if you want to have the option of being that specific, then go ahead and do enable the individual feedback options over here, again, via the question settings for your test.